and this new expansion is called Relics of the Forge, and this one is a standalone expansion that can be played on its own or mixed with the original game. But before I get into what exactly the new expansion adds, I'll first explain how the original game plays for anyone that's not familiar. And this is a game that offers a bunch of different characters that you can play as. You're going to be choosing one at the start of the game, with each of them having some different stats and different abilities that you'll be able to take advantage of. And this is a game that plays over a series of turns, where at the start of each of your turns, you're always going to be discarding 2 cards from the top of the dungeon deck. And what this does is basically limit the amount of cards that you're actually going to run into, adding a little bit of variability from game to game, and each time that you go through this dungeon deck. And these cards represent different rooms in the dungeon that could contain different monsters or traps, and the next thing the player is going to have to do is choose one of these rooms to enter. If all the cards are face down, you're just going to have to choose one randomly, flip it up, and then enter that room, and then face whatever challenge awaits. Each challenge is going to require the player to roll their dice with the goal of rolling certain colored dice above certain values to cover up as many of these spaces as possible on the card. The pool of dice that you actually get to roll is going to be determined by your character's stats, with each of those stats representing access to a different colored die. This means that your character is going to be more or less equipped to defeat certain enemies, depending on the colors that they require. But you're going to be rolling those dice and then covering up as many of these spaces as you're able to, because for each space that you're not able to cover up, that's going to be costing you either some amount of health or some amount of time in the game. And the way the time's lost in this game is by discarding cards from the top of the dungeon deck, essentially making you go through that deck a little bit faster. But if you're able to survive after you've resolved all the negative effects of each of the spaces you weren't able to cover up, you do always complete the challenge, and the nice thing about this is that this does present you with a few options for upgrading your character. Each of these cards actually offers 4 different ways that you can do this, because you can slide the card behind your character sheet on the left-hand side in order to increase your character's stats, allowing you to roll new dice or just increase your overall health. But if you'd rather slide the card underneath your character sheet, this will instead grant you the special ability associated with that card. There are limits to the number of cards you can equip to your character, and this is all determined by your character's current level, but luckily this can also be increased, and the way that you do this is by collecting a certain amount of lantern icons, and that is another use of these cards, because each of these cards will grant some amount of lanterns, and if you choose not to equip it to your character, you can choose to spend that card for its lanterns instead, increasing your progress towards the next level. But not all these cards are the same, and rather than offering you a special ability, some of these might offer you a potion instead. And if you choose to take that, you're going to be moving that card onto your reference sheet, adding it to the number of different potions that you've identified at the bottom of that sheet. Each time you do this, it's going to be granting you with a potion token, and each token can be exchanged to activate any of the different potion types that you've identified so far. These potions and special abilities will give you some different options for dice mitigation, or even adding additional dice into your pool for a particular challenge, or even allowing you to heal your wounds if you did take a little bit of damage. But if you do run into a card that you don't feel ready for quite yet, you can always choose to flee rather than continuing on with that challenge. But when you do this, it is going to be burning some time, since you will be going into your next turn, and of course discarding 2 cards from the top of the deck, causing you to go through that deck quicker without getting any sort of upgrade. And the card does remain on the table face up, occupying one of those 4 spots, until you do decide to go and challenge it again in the future. But the game continues like this until you reach the stairs card at the bottom of the deck, and this is going to be taking you through different levels of the dungeon, with each level getting a little bit harder than the previous one. The final floor will also have a final boss that you're going to have to go up against, and there's a bunch of different bosses offered in the game. And these work very similar to the regular encounters, where you're going to be facing any negative consequences at the end of each turn for each of the spaces that you haven't yet covered. But the difference here is that you're going to be continually fighting that boss turn after turn until you're able to fully deplete their health. If you're able to do that before your health runs out first, then you do win the game. As I mentioned before, this new expansion is a standalone expansion, and what that means is that you don't need the original game in order to play it. But this is going to be adding in a few new ideas. First of all, there will be the concept of progression, where you're going to have a sheet where after you defeat a dungeon, you'll be able to unlock different upgrades and then carry those forward into your following dungeon the next time that you play the game. But of course, they wouldn't call this expansion Relics of the Forge if they didn't also add relics, And the way that these work is that when you choose your character, you're also going to be able to choose a relic to enter the dungeon with. And each of these relics is going to have a few different abilities associated with them, and you're going to have to power up those relics in order to gain access to those abilities. You're going to be using the forge in order to do this, but the way that this works is that you're going to be sacrificing some of your dice to use as fuel in order to power up that forge and then activate your relic. This means that there is a bit of a trade-off there, but luckily there are some additional tokens introduced with this expansion that you will be able to use to your advantage as well. And those are pretty much the changes in the gameplay with this one, but since it is a standalone expansion, it will be offering a bunch of new heroes, new bosses, and of course a ton of new challenges. If this one sounds interesting to you, you can check it out and I will have it linked in the description down below.